I'm going to be talking to Jimmy McLaughlin, who's Deputy Head of Policy here at the IOD, about his new article for Director magazine on Generation Y. Well, Jimmy McLaughlin, you're Deputy Head of Policy here at the IOD, and you've written a large piece for the new issue of Director magazine, of course making you the second most interesting person in this month's issue. You've written about Generation Y and their arrival in the boardroom. Could you tell us a little bit, first of all, what do we mean when we talk about Generation Y?
So to define Generation Y, as it were, it's looking at people that are born in the 1980s. The way that I particularly like to characterise it is it's perhaps people that remember doing homework from encyclopedias, and then by the time they got to higher education though, they would never consider using an encyclopedia. So it's a real kind of crossover generation between not completely digital native, but also having grown up using digital an awful amount.
And what is it that marks them in any way distinctive from previous new waves of new generations? There are always going to be younger people coming in to the workforce and to the commercial environment. So what is it that marks them out in terms of perhaps their philosophy or their background that makes them particularly interesting when we're talking about boardroom appointments?
You're absolutely right in the sense that every generation comes forward and they always make big changes to the workplace and so on. But Generation Y, and why they are specific, is the fact that they are so much more connected. They've grown up in a media environment of 24-hour news, which has been condensed now even further into social media, where they're much more aware of what's happening in the world. One of the examples that I look to point at is you look at sort of Live Aid and that in the 1980s, and that was a singular big event that was highlighting global problems, whereas now that kind of information is accessible on a almost daily basis.
So you're saying that this is a generation who are more connected, more aware, access to more information, and that makes them of particular value to boardrooms?
Yeah, it makes them of value to boardrooms because they are much more global in their outlook when it comes to a business point of view. They see opportunities all across the world. It's not just they don't look at it just from a UK perspective, but look at where they can set up businesses and where they can export to all across the world.
So they're more mobile. I mean, I noticed you say in the article that they're 30% more likely to want to work abroad, to want to be internationally mobile. I mean, here at the IOD, a very large percentage of our membership exports. So presumably there is great benefit in if you're sort of thrusting SME, you want to export more, you want to reach new markets, then having the insight or the expertise of a sort of outwardly looking generation is particularly relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. And what is interesting about that statistic particularly is the 30% believe that working abroad can benefit their careers and so on. That actually, when you take that outside of people from the UK, it actually rises to 70%. So it shows how kind of central to the new world the UK scene for Generation Y.
Okay, well look, you make quite a big deal in your article about the emphasis Generation Y put on purpose, on wanting to know what the aims and objectives and reason and purpose of the organisation in which they work actually is, whether that's PwC or whether it's a small startup. But I mean, really, isn't it still a case that these kind of things come down to brass tacks? People want to know how much they're getting paid, and they want to know what the value of the company is. A bit wishy-washy, isn't it, to say that they're more concerned with the sort of philosophical purpose of the organisation? We're still talking about business here.
Well, I think you're right to a certain degree in the sense that salary and career progression are still still 1 and 2 when it comes to what people are looking for from a workforce. But actually, you can see that is changing. The other aspects of it are changing much more in the sense that they are looking for a purpose. They will join PwC, which is a very good example to use. They've done a lot of work around this. They hire 8,000 graduates a year, so they've done a lot of detailed study into this. And the global chairman there, Bob Moritz, says that he's amazed at the fact that they will sit there and ask why they are doing this. They're still keen to know how to do it and so on, but it's a big shift change that he's noticed in the 30 years that he's been there. There is a real purpose now for why are we doing this.
Interesting stuff. Now, of course, the role of a director is a serious position. It is a specific career in its own right, some would say, and it has a very serious level of responsibilities that are attached to it. So, presumably, this is not just a question of boards at any size company saying, oh, we need a young person on our board, or we need a young person around us. That would be too simplistic.
Yeah, absolutely. as with all boardroom diversity, it's a good thing, but what we don't want is tokenism. People need to be there in their own right. One of the leading firms in this has been Tesco, have employed a kind of reverse mentoring scheme where actually a young person, a young graduate, goes in and explains to the board each month about the latest changes in social media, in terms of the internet and so on. But he also gets mentored back by the senior board people as well. So it's much more of a two-way relationship as well.
Do you think the IOD is in any way uniquely placed to facilitate the sort of migration of Generation Y into these board positions or indeed non-executive positions? Because of course our membership is such that we have people at every single stage of their career, including, and particularly recently, hundreds of new, very keen, very hungry, very ambitious and successful young entrepreneurs. So we can presumably facilitate introductions and connections.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. The IOD is in a unique position with this when it comes to both the young aspect of starting up a company, but also how young people can add to older boards, but also on the reverse side, how older generations of board members can actually explain to some of Generation Y about the mistakes they've made. You know, business has changed a lot in 30 years, but the core principles are still the same of it, and that's where the two can learn a huge amount from each other, both perhaps the baby boomer generation and also Generation Y.
And what advice would you give to somebody who was perhaps thinking of reaching out to somebody younger, perhaps that they hadn't normally considered that they would want in their organisation at a board level or a senior executive level? What advice would you give to somebody who was thinking about how they could benefit from the sort of insights that you claim Generation Y have?
I would say, as always, when you're looking to hire a director, look for breadth in what they've done, look across the board at their business experience. Don't just look at somebody in terms of how many social media followers they've got. Sometimes Generation Y gets pigeonholed too much into that, and actually it's what have they done in the existing world? Where have they shown entrepreneurialism, not necessarily in just starting a business, but where have they shown it in their existing job? How can we look at that for what makes a good board director?
And the advice for members of Generation Y, and I know that you list in your article here, you've got a great number of examples of people who are making it and who have made it from this generation, but broader than that, what advice would you give that generation who want to get into a directorship, who want to get into a NED position, that kind of thing? I mean, the IOD is pretty well placed to help them out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the great things that we've just launched here at the IOD is something called the IOD 99, where we're inviting people that have made Generation Y, so those under 35, that have made a startup to join the IOD for £99, and we're running a network club for them where we're putting on masterclasses for how they can understand business better, because it's so easy now in the modern world to start a business that sometimes you can make mistakes quite early on which can actually impact you further down the line. Crowdfunding has been a revolution for the way that Generation Y raise money for their firms, but at the same time sometimes this can lead to quite complicated legal structures. So this is something that the IOD is looking at and helping our IOD 99 members with to make sure that their businesses will be a success in the long run as well.
Well, I think it's great. We've got every generation covered at the IOD, and I'm sure we can do more to make sure they start talking to each other. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much.